Hello and welcome to And the Runner-Up Is. This week on the show, we're talking the 1957 Best Actress race at the Academy Awards, where Joanne Woodward won for her performance in The Three Faces of Eve. But why did she beat fellow nominees Deborah Kerr, Anna Magnani, Elizabeth Taylor, and Lana Turner? We'll explore all this and more today on And the Runner-Up Is. Hello and welcome back to And the Runner-Up Is. I'm your host, Kevin Jacobson, here to talk about the 30th year of Best Actress at the Oscars, which covered the films of 1957. We'll be discussing why Joanne Woodward won, why the losers lost, and who we think was the runner-up of this Best Actress race. And my guest today is making his debut on the show, although it's not our first time talking. I was on his podcast, Categorically Oscars, which he's hosted for a few years now. Another great Oscar-themed podcast. Please welcome to the show, Calum Reed.
Hello. Thank you so much for inviting me. I'm a big fan of the show and what you've managed to achieve with it, and so I'm buzzing about being on the episode and getting to discuss this very strange bunch of movies from 1957. The 1950s, definitely an interesting time.
Indeed, as we've discovered in doing this season. Yes, this is definitely a wild one. But before we talk 1957, let's talk Best Actress as a category. And as I ask all my guests, my first question for you, Calum, what is your favorite Best Actress win of all time?
Well, I love to be different. However, as cliche as it is to say, it would have to be Vivien Leigh in A Streetcar Named Desire, which I think you've heard quite a few times.
I certainly have, yes. But not undeserved, yeah.
No, completely. Yeah, just simply because of how much is going on in the performance, and particularly the scene where they eventually cart her away and she leaves the house with the grace of a monarch, pretty much. And she's just iconic. And I think her turn in Gone with the Wind would probably be second for me as well. So I think that's an example where somebody's nominated for their absolute superlative work. Those two performances, whereas I think in many cases with Best Actress, they can tend to overlook better earlier performances in an actress's career and end up nominating them for kind of lesser work further down the line. But yeah, I can't really see past Vivien Leigh. She was an amazing actress.
You're absolutely right that, those are the two that anyone thinking about Vivien Leigh just automatically goes to, Gone with the Wind and Streetcar. And obviously there's things like Waterloo Bridge and That Hamilton Woman. Yeah. But with a filmography that's like less than 20 credits, I believe, the fact that she had two iconic performances that have endured to this day is pretty remarkable. Yeah, and most actresses would only wish to have that kind of record. So excellent choice there. So obviously we love our winners, but we also love our losers, Calum. So my other question for you is, what would you say is your most heartbreaking loss in Best Actress?
Well, for heartbreaking, if we're going to go heartbreaking, it'll have to be something I lived through. There are a lot of egregious ones from the past where, are worse than this, but I wouldn't call them heartbreaking. But what comes to mind, and I think you're going to be on this wagon with me, is Glenn Close losing Best Actress for The Wife recently.
Yeah, you could say I would agree with that, yeah.
Just because it's the kind of dramatic showcase for an actress that's so often rewarded, and from a woman that's so overdue for an Oscar, that to me it just almost felt like a deliberate slight that they gave it to Olivia Colman, who, if I'm honest, probably gives a better performance than Glenn Close does, but in a film that's not traditionally Beatty, in a role that's not particularly Beatty, apart from the royalty factor. So I just don't understand why they wouldn't give it to Glenn Close. It's a head scratcher for me. You know, it makes me wonder whether there's just all these old dinosaurs in the Academy that won't watch a movie called The Wife.
A fair point. Yes, haven't thought of that aspect of it. Yeah, I do think with that, I'm sure we'll definitely get into it once we get to 2018. That'll be a fun episode for me. But
Get the tissues out for that one.
Exactly, right? The fact that The Favorite did get the 10 nominations was clearly the more seen of the two of them. You know, I get it. But yeah.
But that doesn't always happen, as we might discuss later.
That's fair. Yeah, we do have a performance here in a film that got 9 nominations but did not win anything, oddly enough. So that's an excellent transition for us to get right into it. Let's talk about this year at the Oscars, the 30th Academy Awards. The nominees were Deborah Kerr for Heaven Knows, Mr. Allison, Anna Magnani for Wild is the Wind, Elizabeth Taylor for Raintree County, Lana Turner for Peyton Place, and Joanne Woodward for The Three Faces of Eve, with the winner being Joanne Woodward. All right, so before we break down these performances on that individual level, what would you say your overall thoughts were just from watching all these films sort of back to back over the past week or so?
I thought they were entertaining. Watching them again, I'd seen them all before, apart from Raintree County. But even Raintree County, which, you know, we discussed before the episode, was supposed to be a huge slog, I actually found kind of entertaining in and of itself as well. So it was actually a pleasurable experience watching all of these. The performances, however, I think vary, and I'm not sure any of the performances, you know, I would class as excellent. But yeah.
Yeah. First of all, I love that we have 3 new nominees. That's always a good thing, I think.
Yeah.
You know, very excited to be starting off with Elizabeth Taylor and Joanne Woodward here, too, that we'll be talking about multiple times over the years. But the theme that I find with this lineup is that, for me, it's a kind of tough lineup to watch, actually. I feel like it's a lot of women in peril, or just like having to deal with really terrible men and dealing with like societal expectations. There's a lot of that. So I think on some level there's an entertainment value to this, but in a way that almost feels at times like a bit of schadenfreude in the sense of like these women are kind of being tortured a little bit by their situations. So especially the winner, obviously. But yeah, it's an interesting one where it's a lot of women having to deal with sort of the patriarchy of everything. And I'm sure we'll get into some of the many wild themes in these films, but let's just jump right in. Starting with our first nominee in alphabetical order, we're starting off with Deborah Kerr here for Heaven Knows, Mr. Allison. So she's on her 4th Oscar nomination here, 2nd in a row after The King and I, and she'll get another nomination in 1958 as well. So she's definitely in the prime right now of getting this big recognition from the Academy. And I'm excited to talk about this one because I think it's not the kind of movie that I come across very often on the show so far, at least in Best Actress, in that this is a two-hander. You know, it's Deborah Kerr and Robert Mitchum, and they're the only credited stars here. There are a few other actors in the movie, but in very small bit parts. But yeah, like 95% of the movie, it's just the two of them. And this is a John Huston film. It's been compared to The African Queen in that it's about a Christian woman and a kind of blue-collar, works with his hands, gruff kind of guy thrown together in a sort of survival situation. But as I'm sure we'll talk about, there are ways in which it's quite different. So Heaven Knows Mr. Allison is based on a novel, and it takes place in 1944, somewhere in the South Pacific, as I say in the beginning. There's a Marine, Mr. Allison, played by Robert Mitchum, who escapes from being fired on by the Japanese in the war, and he escapes on a raft and finds this island where seemingly the only person there is this nun, Sister Angela, played by Deborah Kerr. She has a story of her own regarding how she got there, you know, where she and a priest came in. They were trying to rescue another priest and bring him to Fiji, but things went wrong. And the priest that she came in with died, and the priest that they were looking for went missing. So she's pretty much stuck there. And it's about the two of them just trying to survive on this island and dealing with the Japanese troops and just trying to avoid being captured, basically. So let's talk Deborah Kerr. Would love to know your thoughts on Deborah and what you think of her here in Heaven Knows Mr. Allison.
Well, I'm a fan of Deborah Kerr,
Mm-hmm.
and it was nice to see her back in the habit. A decade
Yes, as it were.
after her amazing turn in Black Narcissus, which is kind of an example of what I was saying earlier, that sometimes somebody does an amazing performance early in the career and they don't get nominated for it, but they get nominated for everything after it. But this isn't on that level. But I liked her. I think her Irish accent is extremely solid in the movie. There are nice bits of humour, like when she tries the raw fish. And it's a really big departure from last year's The King and I, where she's so matronly and seems so old. And I feel like in this, she doesn't seem like a woman who's 36 to me in this. She seems like a woman in her 20s. And I think she plays it as if, it's a woman starting out in life very much. So it feels a lot different from the performance the year before. And obviously her and Robert Mitchum worked on a few movies together and became lifelong friends, I think, after this. So I think they had a good chemistry as well. So I liked the performance, but it wouldn't be in my favourite echelons of her performances.
Yeah, that makes sense. I think, this is a fascinating movie, first of all, especially in how it's like tracking this very unconventional relationship between a Marine and a nun. It's like, it sounds like the start of a joke, like what happens when you strand a Marine and a nun on a desert island. But it's like, what happens is that they never really go for any sort of like cheap jokes in a way. And especially when you contrast it with like the African Queen, it's very different in its tone, where both of them are very sincere and earnest in these performances. I mean, like, there's a reference that Mr. Allison makes about like the irony of this whole situation later on in the movie, but I think because of the sort of confines of the production code and everything, I do think they're able to really create this fascinating, subtle dynamic where both of them clearly have some sort of attraction to each other. He's obviously more overt about it than she could be, but I think it's there, and I think it's palpable in the way that they look at each other, but
Yeah.
he is wanting to respect her boundaries and her faith, and I think she's clearly fighting her own desires, but she never acts on them, and all that is going on in the middle of this survival story. And it is interesting to watch this performance as, her being another nun after her in Black Narcissus, where she didn't get nominated. But I think that is inarguably one of her best performances. She's clearly very good at playing these types of characters. And it's no different here. I think she really nails that mix of emotions that you need to see, that this woman is more than just like a prudish kind of nun who's having to deal with this rough and tumble sort of guy. The whole odd couple setup of the film, like it goes beyond that. I think like she's showing that even with how much she's committed to her faith, she's also still like a three-dimensional person. She still has desires. I like whenever she's talking about like the nuns that she used to live with and saying one of them was so beautiful. And it's these scenes where she's like showing the complexities of what it means to be in her position, and how being in this nunnery is kind of like being in the Marines, like the kind of bonds you form.
Yeah.
All the moments we get to see of her clearly having feelings for this man, like I think she's really able to give you that mix, and is never ever going over the top with it, showing the sort of gentility, I guess, but also giving us some kind of hints of what's going on inside.
Yeah, I think because I've never found Robert Mitchum attractive, really, but I have to say, if you're going to provide a temptation to try and coax somebody out of a life of celibacy and solitude. You know, you could do a lot worse than Robert Mitchum at the beginning of this
True.
movie, unshaven, absolute bit of rough that he is, looking like this in 1957. He looks really good in this movie.
Yeah.
But yeah, I'm totally with you with the unspoken sexual desire element of Kerr's performance. It was interesting the way that she reacted to the proposal, the marriage proposal, to me.
Yeah.
Because in the moment, it feels very self-confident. She's confident in her rejection of him. At least that's how I felt about it. And, you know, she's sort of eulogizing about, you know, I'm married to Jesus, etc. And then in the following scene, she's looking at him differently than she was before. And she's faintly upset when he says, you know, what was I thinking? Marine shouldn't get married. So I didn't know whether Carr had consciously decided that it needed time for that proposal to sink in for Sister Angela, and is playing it that way, or whether she doesn't pitch the initial reaction to the proposal right from an acting perspective. Because it's a little inconsistent, but then I'm thinking, well, maybe Sister Angela's gone and thought about it and thought, do I really want to be a nun? Because she's not technically a nun, right?
Right. She hasn't taken her final vows yet. Yeah.
Which is a little bit eye-rolling when they have that scene where she just casually mentions that she's just a nun in training.
Yeah.
Because, I mean, I'm not sure we can call this a romance. I don't know. Can we?
Not particularly. You know, they don't, you know, consummate anything. They don't even kiss, right? It's just kind of like these two people who find themselves in this situation, and it's like somewhat of a brief encounter type of archetype, except again, no actual romantic feelings are expressed unless something happens once the movie's over. Who knows? But yeah, I think it's just kind of this connection between these two people from very different walks of life, and it's just kind of like bonding. But yeah, I do agree with that. I did have that question as well in terms of like, what are her actual feelings in this moment when she's automatically very quick to reject his proposal? Because I do want to give her the benefit of the doubt in the film, the benefit of the doubt that it is taking her that amount of time to really realize. She has to sleep on it to realize that, oh, maybe I'm questioning certain things that I didn't think I would. I love that day after scene where he does say that thing about how, you know, Marines shouldn't marry, but then the shot just lingers on her, and it shows that some part of her is a little bit just disappointed. You know, I think she plays that very well. She's always been really good at playing that like hidden disappointment that other people can't see, but that we as an audience can see. That's part of why I've really responded to Deborah Kerr in this era. Is it feels like you're kind of in on a secret with her.
Yeah, I mean, because when that happens with the scene where she's saying, oh, I'm not really a nun yet, it almost signaled to me that the film was like sort of softening the blow,
right,
of like this religious figure being tempted into a life with an oily Marine. But then it doesn't go there. And I kind of admired the film for that. I thought, you know, there isn't a traditionally romantic ending. And I think while there's still hope for Allison, to be honest, I don't think that's the end of the matter. It's left fairly open, and that made sense because people don't just jump into decisions, you know, in everyday life based on such an extreme situation. So it made sense in that regard. But to go on to John Huston, he loved a holiday, didn't he? Old Houston.
He loved just an excuse to go off to a different country. Yes.
So this was Trinidad, right?
I believe so, yes. Yep. So, I mean, a beautiful location, clearly. They made good use of what I imagine was a pretty small budget. So, yeah, I think, honestly, not to foretell what we're going to talk about later, but this was the movie that I thought was probably the best of the five, just in terms of film itself. Not necessarily speaking to the performance quite yet. I don't want to spoil my thoughts there, but I did find this to be kind of a strange little movie that we don't typically see in the studio system very much, and especially one that's getting these Oscar nominations. So I was very pleased with this. This was my first time watching. So Yeah, I really really like her here. I think she has some really good comedic moments, like when she's sort of like, choking down that fish. It's tough for her to really adjust to like the elements and things like that. I love when she's like very eagerly saying that she knows how to thatch. She knows how to like weave. It's these really fun little moments that again are not necessarily going into the super broader aspects like we would see in the African Queen, but feel just kind of down to earth and raw and naturalistic. So yeah, I was a really big fan of this performance. It didn't ultimately surprise me that it's a performance that didn't end up winning for her, much like her other 5 nominations, because I don't know if there's particularly one scene that you could be like, oh my god, that's incredible acting. It's just this very consistent kind of performance, but that doesn't make it any less impressive to me.
Yeah, I mean, in terms of African Queen, I think African Queen is a superior film, but
Mm-hmm.
there are elements of Heaven Knows Mr. Allison that feel weightier, and in
Right.
general, the stakes are higher. Like, I watched The African Queen for a second time recently, and it's kind of fluff, to be honest,
Yeah.
most of it. Whereas in this, I don't think we ever feel like either character will die in this, but there's a genuine peril there. There's a moment where it feels like they're going to be captured, and then the allies,
Mm-hmm.
come to save the day. I don't think I liked the film as much as you because I was disinterested in some sequences of it, and I think they focus a bit too much on the wartime elements and not enough on the development of the relationship. So I think there was kind of room for thornier moments in their relationship. It's all apart from the sequence where Allison gets drunk. They don't. There's
Mm-hmm.
never really any conflict or debate or anything like that. And I think it could have done with a little bit more meat on the bones in that way. I think there was room for maybe something else to happen. Maybe there could have been another character. But I know this is based on a book, though, so I'm sure they were being faithful to the book. But they
Yeah.
talk about building a raft, but then that doesn't really come into fruition. It doesn't really form a huge part of the story. So I thought it sort of offered up avenues and then didn't go down them. And I thought, maybe it could have added another element, another dimension to it by trying something different and ditching the Japanese soldiers, or at least some of those scenes. But
I would agree that I'm not particularly interested in like when he goes off into the Japanese camp and he's trying to find the supplies and everything. It
mm,
just kind of feels like a distraction from what we're actually doing here, just the fact that it's focused on for so long. The thing that I really connected with in this is I felt like this idea of two very different people from opposite ends of life, essentially, and not life, but just like very opposed viewpoints in a way. And yet, him starting to realize sort of something beyond what he physically knows into something a little bit more spiritual and emotional and
mm,
intuitive. And then her kind of realizing the more grounded realism that he's presenting to her and sort of just like coming together in that way. They're both kind of becoming more self-actualized people. That's the thing that I kind of responded to most here. And they both are charting that journey well enough to where it's not like they become totally different people by the end, but you can tell that they've both been changed by this experience. And so by the time you get to the end and she tells him, she says, "You will be my dear companion always."
mm.
That moment does land for me. I don't know about you. It felt like they've both been through something very traumatic, and now they'll always have this bond. No matter what shape it takes after this, they'll
Yeah,
always have this.
yeah, and I think that does give him a little bit of hope as well that maybe
Yeah,
she's considering coming to his side of things. But I
right.
think because if you read the plot of this to somebody, you'd expect it to be very unsubtle, but it actually is pretty subtle. When it comes to it, it's not like a swept away situation where it's the rich bitch and the fisherman. Um,
Right.
it, which I love Swept Away, the original Italian film, less so the Madonna film. But
Fair.
although I think she's actually quite good in that, but
Hot
yeah.
take, but go on.
But it's deceptively subtle actually, and I think John Huston was like this with movies. I think he had a good instinct for taking the sensationalist out of movies and getting down to the earthiness of the story and the themes and what he actually wanted to achieve with it. So it's not in any way cartoonish, and that's a credit to it, bit because the premise itself, because we haven't mentioned this, but he's an ex-convict, right? So it's almost like the jailbird and Nun. So
Yeah, exactly.
given that dynamic and that premise, it's a lot more nuanced than it has any credit to be honest.
Yeah. And again, it's John Huston and Deborah Kerr and Robert Mitchum just being completely earnest, but not making it feel overtly corny as it maybe could be. So yeah, it's a good tone, I think, that they captured here. And before we move on, I just wanted to read this really lovely quote that Robert Mitchum said after working with her. Robert Mitchum was rather notorious for betting his co-stars, we can say, and was just very much that guy. But with Deborah Kerr, they had a very different kind of relationship, and it was something more, ironically, a bit more like what we see in this film, where they just had this kind of kinship together. And he referred to her, he said, "The best, my favorite life would be kind if I could live with Deborah around."
Oh.
Which is just like really sweet, and I can't even imagine someone saying that about me. It's just like, wow. But you could definitely see that bond, I think, by the end of the film. It's that even though they both seem to come from different walks of life, that they strangely complement each other in a way.
And you could see it in the Sundowners. They seem like a married couple. They've been married for 20 years,
Yeah.
There's definite kinship there between them. So.
Yeah. So, do you have anything else on Deborah before we move on?
Just that she was a brilliant actress and should have won an Oscar. It's sad that she didn't.
It really is. The fact that she got 6 nominations and they never found it in their hearts to give her one is absurd. Absurd. But at least they gave her an honorary down the line.
Yeah.
All right. Well, let's move on to someone that they did give an Oscar. And now here's her follow-up nomination, Anna Magnani for Wild is the Wind. So I think you could consider this, depending on how you feel about it and depending on your definition of this word, you could call this an afterglow nomination, right?
Yeah.
Because she won for The Rose Tattoo in 1955. Here she is 2 years later, and she's back with the producer of that film, Hal Wallace, who wanted to work with her again, and she actually suggested that they adapt this Italian film called Furia, and she got what she wanted. She was an Oscar winner at that point. She had power, and she used it for what she wanted. So she was paired with Anthony Quinn, who also already had 2 Oscars by that point in supporting, now making the jump up to lead. Apparently the set was tumultuous, from what I have read. George Cukor came in at the last minute to direct. Anna had an affair with one of her fellow actors. There was a lot of fiery tempers happening. There was a lot going on, which is kind of weirdly fitting, I think, with the nature of this film, you could say.
Yeah.
So to get into a summary, it's about this sheep herder in Nevada named Gino, played by Anthony Quinn, who is grieving the loss of his wife, Rosanna, and he decides that rather than go to therapy, he'll go to Italy and marry his dead wife's sister, Gioia, played by Anna Magnani. So they go back to their ranch, and Gioia doesn't know a word of English, and it takes a lot of time for her to adjust to this new environment, but she learns it over time, and also having to deal with Gino still not having properly gotten over his wife, and basically using Gioia as a replacement who he's just constantly disappointed with. Naturally, this leads to some frustration on Gioia's part, and she decides to have an affair with Benny, who's this ranch hand there. So that's the film. Would love to know your thoughts here on Anna Magnani, and maybe even your thoughts on her previous win for The Rose Tattoo, and what you think of this follow-up nomination.
Out of interest, who did she have an affair with? Did it say?
The actor who played Benny, ironically.
Oh, okay. Well, I don't blame her. Okay.
Yeah, exactly, right?
On The Rose Tattoo, I'm a Susan Hayward voter in 55, but I think Magnani's excellent in The Rose Tattoo, so I'm a big fan of the performance, and I'm a big fan of her in general, Rome Open City, and in this too. I think there was just something about her that she had this abandon, I think, as a performer that really lent itself to acting. And I think, because there was a lot made of Anna Magnani's Oscar win, because it was her first English language film, right? The Rose Tattoo. And she wasn't, she turned it down quite a lot because she wasn't particularly comfortable with the English language. And I think that kind of factors into this movie and her interpretation of Joya, and how successful it is, because in the early portions of the movie, Joya is attempting to grasp the language, sometimes reluctantly. And I imagine Magnani herself, only 2 years after the Rose Tattoo, probably still not fully on board with the English language. So I'm sure she could relate to that, and all of that comes across in a very naturalistic way. And because it happens at the beginning of the movie, I think it grounds the film in a place where we're convinced by the characters and we're convinced by the premise. And I thought Magnani was great in this, and I liked the film too until the end.
Until the end. Yeah, we'll get to that. I was really surprised personally by how much I loved this performance. I think she's at the top of her game here. It's not the best material, I would say. I don't know if the film really comes together for me in the end, as you said, but none of that has to do with her performance. I think she is single-handedly elevating what would probably be a dull 2-star movie, to be honest, and really giving so much more depth than what's on the page for her.
Yeah.
Like in the beginning, you're seeing how shell-shocked she is by this new environment, and she really is letting that play out on her face gradually in that first act, until she just can't take it anymore. And that frustration keeps building up very subtly, I think, to where you are actively rooting for her to kind of have this affair and to somehow get out of this relationship with Gino, who has zero redeeming qualities as far as I'm concerned.
Yeah.
Just an absolute toxic void of a person who needs therapy desperately, like I said, and is not getting the help he needs and probably never will, because it's the 50s and it is what it is. But then you're kind of rooting for her to have her own agency, in this place that has just completely stripped her of that. And it's because of things that are out of her control. And I think she really is capturing that feeling of being trapped in that situation and just doing whatever she needs to do to find some level of freedom within these confines. But what I also love is that she's sort of peppering in the tragedy of her situation with these lighter moments. Like we see her laughing at certain things, sometimes just little things, like in the beginning when she's trying out like the instant coffee and she doesn't really like it. We see like these little moments of like who this person could be if she had the freedom to just live life on her own terms, except she's just trapped in this situation. And it's kind of, again, to speak to what I was saying at the beginning of this episode, a kind of tough watch for me to see her dealing with all this.
You'd be surprised how many men replace the dead wife pretty quickly. Like, it's not just a 1950s thing. I know of a couple of men, that have married the wife's sister, like within 3 months or something. I think some men just can't function on their own, to be honest. But
yeah,
the movie for me, I think, how did this lose Best Original Song? Like, isn't it beautiful? My God, what a beautifully written song. And
yeah,
I think not only in terms of a song, but for the film, I think it completely underscores the themes of the film, which it does have this wild, loose feeling about it. And Magnani is contributing a lot to that, more than anything else to do with the film, like you said, really. But it's just tinged with this sort of violent passion, even if the plot itself isn't that complicated, the film feels on edge. It's edgy throughout, which is why I didn't like the ending, because it sort of wanted to neatly tie things in a bow. But I think Johnny Mathis' song is wonderful. Obviously, Nina Simone's version is better. But
iconic.
Johnny Mathis doesn't get enough credit. He had a lovely voice.
Also, shout out to David Bowie as well.
And David Bowie, yeah. Is it
Yeah.
Matt Monroe as well? There's a few people that have done it, I think.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
But I think I liked what it was saying about romance, and I think that was its biggest strength. What it was saying about life, that life can be tempestuous, romance can be messy. And the film seemed to be recognizing that in a way that wasn't critical of sex. It wasn't critical of sexual impulses.
Mm-hmm.
But the fact the ending then goes against that for me in a big way. Like, it feels like for all the world, this film is going to have a messy, tragic finale. And then the ending with Gino and Joya reconciling sort of just backs up the importance of the institution of marriage in a
Right.
way that I felt was quite conservative. And
Mm-hmm.
that's not to say that monogamy is not important, but they've only been married a few months. He keeps calling her by his dead wife's name. He doesn't take her out anywhere. He's unequivocally a bad husband. So
Yeah.
the most appropriate result for all concerned, I think, would be a follow your heart message. And maybe it ends in tragedy, and that's fine. And instead it veers the other way. So it's almost like the ending didn't fit with the whole ethos of the movie.
Yeah. It screams Hollywood ending, studio notes, rewrite the ending.
Yeah. And this is after the Code, right? So this is not even a Code movie.
No, this is this is like towards the end of the Code, but we're still in it. Yeah.
Oh, okay. Right.
Yeah. But yeah, I think that's the thing that kind of bothered me, to speak to what you were saying about just the ending. It's sort of like, so by the end, it's just this feeling of like, oh, I guess this is just what you have to deal with in marriage, is just to bear with each other and kind of like hate each other, and that's it. I agree that just this is a film that feels like it's just gonna end in at least 2 deaths.
Yeah.
Like, there's just gonna be something very dramatic that happens, which something does happen when Gino does come home and finds out about the affair, but then it sort of peters out into this artificially hopeful ending that maybe they'll reconcile. And it's actually something that weirdly resonates with 2 Joan Fontaine performances in films. Bear with me here.
Okay.
I don't know if the comparison is perfect, but just this, it's a kind of film that reminds me of Rebecca to a certain extent, and what Joan Fontaine is doing in that film, which is just entering this new world that has all these rules and customs that she didn't really sign up for. But she just has to deal with it, and the fact that her husband can't get over his first wife, that sort of thing. But then also it's like the ending of Suspicion in a way for Joan Fontaine, where we're kind of just having to buy that she's just gonna give up and not follow her instincts and just try to reconcile with this guy who tried to kill her.
Yeah.
And it's just like, it gives you a weird icky feeling by the end that like you don't want this for this character, and that doesn't feel like the right ending for the film, and yet here we are.
That Suspicion ending is awful, by the way.
Yeah.
To think they could have, I think one of the options was that she drank the poison and
Yeah, that was the original
she'd
ending.
posted a letter or something, and
Yep.
that would have been so much better. But yeah, that is terrible. But yeah, I get where you're coming from. I think like Magnani, the way that Magnani acts is so, obviously she wasn't, English wasn't her first language, but I think the way, I don't think she could ever be meek, like Joan Fontaine, but it's right. It's the same principle, and it's very subtle the way that she does it in certain ways, even though, she throws her arms about and this fiery passion. There are little moments, like you said, with the coffee and things like that, where it's like she's going through the motions of sort of adjusting. I think like I would have liked a bit more of a I would have settled for a more judgmental result for the movie. Like, I think it could have really been a critique of infidelity, which there's a lot of, sanctimonious movies from the 50s that do this, but it would have fit a bit better if it sort of doubled down on the idea of an extramarital affair being a folly, and all this has led to disaster and tragedy would ensue. I think there are different reasons why people go to the movies, but I think one of them is to see characters making riskier, bolder decisions that they wouldn't make. the people watching wouldn't make. Like, what would happen if you gave in to that impulse? Would everything go to shit, or would there be an alternative, better life waiting for you? And it's that kind of fear of the unknown that makes the movie sort of interesting, and Magnani's performance interesting, you know, that she doesn't have that fear. She dives into it, and she loves Benny, and she'll go with him, and then in the next scene she'll go back to Gino. It's sort of like she moves with the wind, like the movie is saying. But I love the scene where she goes to Benny's room, which is sort of the most sordid the film gets. And she looks at him and just closes her eyes, as if to say, I know this is wrong, but I just can't help myself. And then closes the door. And I just thought that was perfect. But the whole of like real life affair adds a little bit of an extra dimension to it.
I know, right?
Yeah. But because in that scene, the big confrontation scene on the hill,
right,
it feels like Anthony Quinn's actually slapping him. Like you could see the contact. It's not fake slapping, and that makes me think: was there bad blood there? Was there some kind of grudge because of what was going on during the filming?
Yeah, there was no love lost between a lot of the stars here. Again, it's very fitting that there was a lot of fiery tempers behind the scenes here. But yeah, I think in terms of the affair, do you sort of feel swept away by just like that relationship? I think obviously they can't go too far with it because it's the code and everything, but did you feel the passion there that you're supposed to feel? Or I don't know if you are supposed to feel it, depending on what you're saying about the ending. Like, who knows?
I mean, I think Anthony, is it Franchosa?
Yes.
Yep. He's obviously very attractive. I think Benet's character could have done with some earlier scenes that featured him more and had more of his perspective, because it feels like, oh, suddenly Anthony Quinn, Gino's got an assistant, and you think, okay. And he's actually quite dishy, but he'd never been featured really much in the early part of the movie. I think I liked the scene where she hits him and makes his lip bleed. And
yes.
And then he like kisses her again, and I thought, I quite like this, just because it was sort of it was an unspoken, it was there kind of thing, you know. He liked that, and he liked her wildness, and that to me felt impulsive and felt like what the movie should have been going for all along. But in general, it's a pretty basic plot, really. It's not especially intricate in terms of its plot. I think the themes, the acting, the relationships themselves are more interesting, but probably Gino and Joya's relationship is a lot more interesting than Bene. I think Bene is just a side piece, really. A catalyst for the other drama. Yeah,
I do like that scene that you're referring to, I think, where she literally says, I'll kill you, and then they just kiss again. Because he's like preventing her from being struck by the horse, and he just like impulsively kisses her, and she's like, oh God, but then she just can't help herself it away. Yeah, that's a good scene. I do love whenever she gets especially fiery. I think, you know, the word volcanic was used a lot when describing Anna Magnani performances, and you really feel the storm going on within her that just can't help but explode out. And you don't know, like, you don't want to be on the other end of it sometimes you do. It's a lot of energy. But again, like, she also has those lighter moments. And one that I think I really weirdly resonated with is towards the beginning, where it's after that first very awkward dinner that happens, and she just has to get out of the house, and she talks with, I think it's Angie is the daughter. It's her niece, I think. And, you know, Joya is saying how much she looks like her mother. And it's, even though she's speaking Italian, you know exactly what she's saying, just in like saying how beautiful she is and giving off this kind of body language, and you feel like she's kind of accepting her as her family in that moment. I like those very few moments we get in the film of tenderness and caring. You know, obviously we see her later on trying to help around the house, but you know, the Gino's mother just refuses to allow another woman to just you know, come in and disrupt anything. those moments of caring is when I really found more dimension in the performance.
Yeah. I think you can see a lot of that, more of that in The Rose Tattoo, which is
Yeah, certainly.
very up and down as a performance. Like I've
Yeah.
never seen any material, any interviews with Anna Magnani, nothing off camera, or off celluloid. But I would be shocked if she wasn't like this in real life. Like it just feels like for all the world, like that's just her being. And I think that's probably the biggest compliment you can give an actress is when you see the performance and it's just like they're not acting.
Yeah.
Because even if she's kind of like this, she's still true to the character and she's still true to the story. And I think that's all you can ask of an actor, really. But yeah, it's such a great performance. I think you mentioned Angie. I think Angie could do with more screen time as well. It's very much a two lead situation. Anthony Quinn, Anna Magnani, the two names on the poster. They must have a lot of screen time, the pair of them. And there isn't really room for anyone else to come in. Like there's a scene near the end where some random person tells Anthony Quinn, "Oh, you've not treated her right." And I was thinking, who are you? You weren't in the rest of the movie. So it did feel very unevenly weighted towards its stars, I think.
Yeah, I think for the most part it sort of just feels like an excuse to give these really, volcanic kinds of actors, Anthony Quinn and Anna Magnani, an excuse to just like go up against each other, and it's an actor's vehicle more than anything else. So doesn't surprise me that it gets these 2 nominations plus the song. Like that's very obviously the 3 nominations you would give to this film, and nothing else even comes close to that. Although honestly, I don't know if I would nominate Anthony Quinn, if I'm being honest. I think he's a little hammy, to put it lightly.
Yeah, I was ready to say about halfway through, why has he got a nomination? And then towards the end, I think he gets better. And maybe can just about justify it. But I think the Academy was far too kind to Anthony Quinn in general. Like I've never seen him in a film and thought, oh, he was great. Like not even Zorba the Greek. I don't think he was particularly great in that either. So
yeah, I would agree with that as well. But I think for Anna Magnani, I think this is a really good follow-up nomination. Great performance.
Yeah.
And I'm glad it wasn't just like a one-time thing with her. And it makes a lot of sense to me that actors really respected her style of acting at a time when there was still just kind of the classical mode of acting in this more overt and over-the-top way. She really was very internal and very naturalistic, and I think actors really respected that. And another part of this is that she once again did not campaign for this nomination, and she did not campaign for the win once she got the nomination. She just let it speak for itself, much like she did with The Rose Tattoo, and I respect that.
Yeah, and I think Melina Mercouri, who you're going to talk about 3 episodes time, again, we're starting to see Sophia Loren. We're starting to see European actresses come in with different styles, and that makes the Oscars more exciting, more diverse. And I think also we were mentioning Vivien Leigh's 2 nominations earlier. I think as somebody with 2 nominations, you can't get much better than Anna Magnani's 2 nominations, really. The quality is just high. The bar is high with her.
Indeed. And you're right, she is kind of the blueprint, with actresses from other countries, European countries especially, really showing a different mode of acting than opening people's eyes up a little bit to what acting can be. So on that note, I think it's time to move on to our next nominee, shall we?
This is the one. What a movie.
Elizabeth Taylor in Raintree County. So excited that we are officially finally in the Elizabeth Taylor era.
Yeah.
This is the first of 4 consecutive years that we'll be talking about her. Nominated her 4 years in a row, culminating with that first win for Butterfield 8. And then she wins again a few years later for Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf. So let's talk Liz. Just to introduce her to the audience, she was a child star in the 40s in movies like National Velvet, Courage of Lassie, Life with Father, Cynthia, Little Women. She was in these more ingenue types of roles in A Place in the Sun, which we talked about on the show, Father of the Bride, Ivanhoe, Giant the previous year, and then here comes Raintree County, which is another collaboration with her best friend, Montgomery Clift, and this happens to be the film where Montgomery Clift gets into his accident and she helped to save his life, and he had to get plastic surgery to restore what happened to his face. And you see some of that in this film, where the pre-accident scenes are and where the post-accident scenes are, which made this kind of a sad watch at times for me. But it's also a very long film, and a film that MGM was desperately hoping to make the next Gone with the Wind. I think that's very apparent. So it's based on a novel, just like Gone with the Wind, and it takes place during the Civil War era, just like Gone with the Wind. And Montgomery Clift plays this idealist type of guy named John, who's living in Raintree County, Indiana. He meets this young woman, Susanna, played by Elizabeth Taylor. She's this Southern belle type who comes from money, and she's visiting the town, and they have a connection. Then she leaves and comes back and reveals to him that she's pregnant, and he's the father. So he goes off and marries her, and they go to her hometown in the South. Also, she's racist.
Just a bit.
Yeah, a little bit. She's horrified when she learns that he's an abolitionist, and then it's revealed that there's some weird dynamic going on with her parents and this woman named Henrietta. How they all died in a fire when she was younger, so she has a dark past. And then over time, it seems like her feelings are changing a little bit, but she's mostly just sort of haunted by her past and dealing with all the different changes going on in the Civil War era. So there's a lot more to this movie, but thankfully, for time purposes, we only really need to talk about Elizabeth Taylor. So Elizabeth Taylor's obviously an icon. She's one of the most well-known movie stars of her era. So curious what your thoughts are on Liz and what you think of her in her first nominated performance here.
I think I'm not a massive fan of Elizabeth Taylor, to be honest, but I think less so as an actress, more so as a person, and I think she did a lot of great work and was a great advocate for LGBT. I think through her canon of Best Actress nominations, you gradually see her get better and better to the culmination of that, which is her unforgettable performance in Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf, which is just other level compared to all of her other performances for me. This is her first, and I think it's her worst nomination, but I think she's okay. I don't think she's bad. I think she's all right. I wasn't looking forward to the film, and for some reason I'd anticipated that the performance wouldn't be showy. But it kind of is. And she introduces the irregularities in Susanna's character in fairly measured way. It sort of gradually creeps up on us in the same way that it does to John, that, oh shit, this girl is a nut. And the marriage is sort of doomed from the beginning. But I thought she was all right. Like, I can't go any more than that, but it was better than I was expecting based on other people's reactions.
Well, I'm a big fan of Elizabeth Taylor. I think she had incredible screen presence. I will say, though, that I think she's one where when she was in the right role and got to really dig into a character, she was great. I love her in Virginia Woolf.
Yeah.
Cat on a Hot Tin Roof, Place in the Sun even. She has these really transcendent moments, I think, on screen. And then sometimes it doesn't really work out as well. And I think with Raintree County, it's a role that is very juicy on the page, but I don't think she works particularly well as this character. I think the accent work is not great. I think she has moments later on where she does pretty well with the bigger sort of theatrical moments that come towards the end.
Yeah.
But I think the material for me just doesn't really come to life. I do lay a lot of the blame here on the writing and also, I guess, the direction too. I found myself a little lost, to be honest, as to like the motivations of these characters. I think everyone's a little lost at sea here, to be honest. I think, unfortunately, it's clear that Montgomery Clift was a little checked out here for understandable reasons.
Yeah,
I think
I think I would lay most of the blame with the source novel, to be honest, because and it's a really weird tale behind it, isn't it? This guy Ross Lockridge Jr. wrote Raintree County and was a bit of a tragic figure. He had depression, killed himself at 33, the day after the novel was declared a bestseller. And like he approached the writing of the novel like he deliberately set out to produce the best piece of literature ever. That's what he wanted to do. And I think you can see from this film that the novel has a desperation about it, and it really seems to be striving to be important. And that's a big part of why it didn't work for me. It felt like it was all too much, and there was too many things floating around without much conviction.
Yeah, that it does make a lot of sense what you're saying, that, you know, he did really set out to make like the great American novel, all in capital letters. And what happens is just like a mishmash of all these different things that don't really come together particularly well. I mean, I think with the Elizabeth Taylor character, I think that's trying really hard to make it into like a Scarlett O'Hara type of character, to go back to Gone with the Wind.
Yeah.
And it's not really getting to that place, because I just think the character is kind of kept very purposefully vague when it comes to like her past and everything, which, you know, can work in certain movies and certain characters. But I just found myself feeling such a distance from these characters that it was really hard to sustain my interest for close to 3 hours. This movie is 170 minutes, and don't think it particularly justifies that runtime. It just doesn't have a lot to say, or at least I didn't find a lot. It's just like a series of events happening, and I don't find to be a greater insight by the end of all this, unless you found something profound maybe in this ending. Maybe we'll talk about that. But I was mostly left with her performance feeling like it was a lot of play acting more so than really inhabiting a character. And again, I agree with you that I feel like just the source material just prevented that from happening.
I mean, there are a few hilarious moments in this movie. Like when Taylor's called upon to do emotional turmoil, I think it can be a little bit all over the place. Like, I couldn't help but laugh when she's at Henrietta's grave, screaming that, "I love you, Henrietta." It just comes from nowhere, which I think is kind of part of the character's illness. So I'm hoping that they've thought enough about that. But as an outburst, it's just so random and unhinged. But it does come off as more unintentionally comedic than serious. And the nature of the performance, I think, is strangely aligned with the other absurdities in the movie, which is why I'm giving it a bit more credit than it might deserve, because I think it actually works in terms of its sort of randomness and amateurishness. At times kind of fits with some of the stuff in the novel, some really silly motifs we've got here at work. Like the movie's framed by this legend of the Raintree.
Yeah.
It's supposed to be, you know, if you find this original Raintree of the county, then you'll have this prosperous and worthwhile life or whatever, which is really stupid. It's this like romantic notion, but it's never fully fleshed out. And John seems like quite a together person, so the idea of him being like so hung up on this is like pretty unconvincing. And then there's the whole thing with Susanna and the burnt out doll, which makes an appearance in like the final frame of the movie. I don't know why. I don't know what the film thinks it's saying with that. But it's just another sensationalist tactic of Lockridge's writing, I think, that comes up. And this is a strange comparison, but stick with me here. It reminded me of the Lindsay Lohan film, I Know Who Killed Me,
Wow, okay. Did
which
not expect that reference, but yes, go on.
yeah. Yeah, Lindsay Lohan and Liz Taylor side by side again. Yes, I realize it's a strange reference, but it's this. The film just felt like this really strange mix of luridness and pretension
Mm.
that's entertaining in a way, but full of ideas that aren't, sort of developed properly and don't fuse together in a valuable way. The themes, the motifs, they don't coalesce. It's somebody trying to be important and not succeeding, and it was just I feel like we're rubbernecking talking about this movie. It was a car crash.
Yeah, I just feel like I don't know if the people involved with the film felt that sense of like the campiness that we're referring to here
Mm.
in terms of the overall like luridness and the over the top aspects of it. I feel like everyone's sort of trying to come at it at a pretty genuine, earnest place, and that what we see on the screen is not what the intention was. So it's hard for me to fully feel like this was a successful performance in the end if it feels kind of mismatched from what her intentions might have been. Hard to say what her intentions were because I'm not her, but it just seems like not the right result in the end, for me at least.
Yeah, I mean, I think it does want to be Gone with the Wind, but
Yeah,
Susanna doesn't really have a perspective. I feel like
that's the problem.
we're
Yeah.
not seeing it from her perspective. And does it want to be told from a Yankee perspective? I also thought it was slightly unclear on that front. Like, you've even got like a man of color, Nat King Cole, is singing the theme song, right? So,
Mm-hmm.
but the film is set, while set in the north, it's set in a Copperhead town, which I didn't know what that was, but apparently it means a southern sympathizing town in the north.
Yeah.
It does feel like it's trying to appeal to both sides by setting it
Mm-hmm.
there. Um, so if you're doing that, you've not really got an individual perspective that's different from Gone with the Wind in that sense. And I love Gone with the Wind, one of my favorite movies, but it's definitely not on the right side of history. But I think even the production values, like this is supposed to be the most expensive movie ever at the time of this was filmed, and it's like a low rent Gone with the Wind in terms of its production
Yeah,
values.
totally.
Going on location, I don't think helps it.
Yeah.
And when they get to that burned out old plantation, you can't help but compare it to Scarlett going back to revisit Tara after it's been, decimated. And it's
Mm-hmm.
such a step down as a moment and as a visual set piece. So I feel like where did the money go? Honestly,
Yeah.
did it go to Elizabeth Taylor? I don't know. I don't know where the budget went.
Yeah, I I would agree with that. There's not even really a very visually striking shot that I can remember from the film.
No.
So yeah, not great on even a visual level either. So not a lot for me to recommend at the end of the day. But I do enjoy the random moments where she does get to play around a little bit with the character. Like there's a
Mm.
point where after they leave Raintree County and they go to the south, then they go back to Raintree County. They just keep going back and forth, but they're back, and this woman named Nell, who's played by Eva Marie Saint, she used to be in a relationship with John, but that obviously he found Elizabeth Taylor and went off with her. But they're back, and they have this scene where Susanna is outside of their big mansion and she sees Nell and they have this conversation, and she kind of like chastises Nell for not calling on her because like she's been back for a while and yet she hasn't been called on by her. And she
Mm.
just has this excellent Elizabeth Taylor like head bitch in charge energy that I love to see from her. Just like totally owning it and totally confident. I love those moments where she gets to just be totally uninhibited. That's my kind of my favorite version of Elizabeth Taylor, even though it's very over the top. I enjoy moments like that in a film that is often deathly serious about most of its themes and everything.
Yeah, and I think like Taylor was probably at her best when she was using her sort of sexual
Exactly.
energy. Even in Virginia Woolf, there's a lot of that
Hmm.
in a completely different way. But the character of Susanna, I mean, I just didn't expect the movie to be about a guy having to cope with his insane racist wife. Like, I mean, she might even be more imbalanced than Eve in Three Faces of Eve, which we're going to talk about later. But she's just such a loose cannon. And I think if you're making a film about issues of pre-Civil War America, why are you framing the central mystery around a woman hung up on race? I don't know. It felt like a really strange way to frame the film for me. What was with the professor guy? Like, that character feels like it's completely from a different movie. I couldn't believe it when he popped up again on the battlefield. Like, I thought we were rid of him.
That reeks of this being adapted from a novel, and just that whole thing was not adapted well. We see that sometimes where, we're adapting this huge book and then we have to have all these different characters, and you can only imagine that character is more important in the book and factors more into things. And as is now, it's like, who is this guy? Why do I care? Yeah. And also that whole scene, the sequence really where they all go off to war, it's like a half hour long, and just at that point I was just like, this thing is endless.
Yeah, it's a real departure, isn't it, for the movie?
Yeah. Like, suddenly it becomes about war, and then that's kind of where he finds out about her going insane upon thinking that Henrietta might be her real mother, and he finds her at an asylum, and then once again they go back to Raintree County. It's just like, I don't know what I'm supposed to be focused on here. I don't know what the tone is. It's just so confused to me. Such whiplash I felt from scene to scene that by the end I just felt like, great, like a lot of sound and fury signifying nothing by the end. Like, all of that money went to a film that just had no concrete meaning to it for me.
Definitely no meaning, but very strange, and I think memorable in many ways.
In its ways, yeah.
I actually thought, like, given the accident, I actually think Montgomery Clift is quite good in the movie, and particularly good in the scene where Nell wishes him luck and gives him, or tries to give him back, the poem that he wrote for her.
Oh, yeah.
And in general, I think the scenes between Clift and Marie Saint were better acted than between Clift and Taylor. Mm-hmm. But, like, his guilt in that moment is really palpable, and it's got an emotional honesty that the film can't really sustain elsewhere. But you can see some scars on one side of his face from the car crash, and by all accounts, he was off his head for most of the production. Mm-hmm. But I think given those constraints, he actually manages to turn in probably my favorite performance in the film.
Yeah, I don't think it's a bad performance by any means. I just felt the weight of what had happened behind the scenes for him, and it was hard for me to really focus on trying to feel like this is its own character so much as Montgomery Clift really just sort of going through the motions in a lot of his scenes, especially when, in comparison to what Elizabeth Taylor's doing, she's just like flying off the handle every other scene, so he's having to kind of react to things. But I was left in a sad place for him mostly by the end. But
do you think the movie deserves to be forgotten? Because it's quite, nobody really mentions it anymore.
Do I think it should be forgotten?
Yeah.
I mean, not necessarily. I don't think most films should be forgotten necessarily. I don't think this is like offensive per se in the sense that like this needs to be buried and forgotten forever. It has an unhinged Elizabeth Taylor performance in it, so there's that at least. But in the end, I do think she sort of handles the last few scenes pretty well. I think in terms of her realizing that she might be holding him back in a way, the way that kind of registers on her face. I think she handles that really well, and sort of saying goodbye to her son and saying like, Daddy will explain it to him someday when he's older and things like that. I think she's pretty well. She ends the film for me pretty strong.
Yeah, I think she's okay, and I like the moments where she's looking for the note that she hasn't written and things like that, mm-hmm. where the Rebecca-ness,
right,
sort of, where it's like she's thinking, is she being gaslighted? am I going crazy, that kind of thing. She does that pretty well, to be honest. And it's a performance from her that I haven't seen before. It is at least something new and different from what she'd done before this.
Yeah, but I would say still weaker than what would be to come, obviously.
Definitely, yeah.
Shall we move on to our final losing nominee?
Let's do it.
All right. Lana Turner for Peyton Place. So, yeah, here we come to another very famous figure of the golden age of Hollywood. A total glamour girl, movie star. She got signed when she was 15, and she did the classic trajectory that we see all the time of the supporting roles and then getting the chance to lead her own films in the 40s and 50s. Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, Postman Always Rings Twice, The Bad and the Beautiful. And then here with Peyton Place, you know, she was a major star, I would say, by this point. Although I think the perception was that she was more movie star than like gritty actress type. And on some level, she was obviously taken seriously, but not enough really to put her in real like heavyweight dramatic parts as much. And Peyton Place, I think, is somewhere in between movie star and sort of character part, where she still has some of that movie star glamour to it, but it is darker material. It's more complex. And I think probably in that respect, it may have surprised some audiences, some critics. So there's a lot to get into with Peyton Place. It's based on a very scandalous book that was adapted and sanitized, of course, by Hollywood in the big screen, but still pretty racy for the time. It's about this fictional town in New England called Peyton Place, which is, tell me if you've heard this before, seemingly idyllic, but there's a lot going on beneath the surface, as we see in most films about white suburban America, which, to be fair, this is one of the early ones, but still, it happens a lot. But Lana is playing Connie, who is this widow with a daughter, Allison, and she owns a dress shop, and she's concerned about her daughter growing up and starting to take interest in boys. And meanwhile, she gets into a relationship with this new man in town, Michael Rossi, who's this new principal at the school. And she has a housekeeper, Nellie, whose daughter, Selena, is friends with Connie's daughter. And at a certain point, there's a scandal in town involving Selena and her stepfather and him forcing himself on her and getting her pregnant. And that just unravels the entire town. And lots of twists and turns develop from there. And eventually we learn more about Connie's background and why she has a kind of perhaps puritanical view of sex and things of that nature. So there's obviously so much we could talk about with Peyton Place. It's 2.5 hours. It inspired a soap opera. It basically inspired things like Desperate Housewives and Twin Peaks and American Beauty, you know, all these different things in later decades about looking closer at what's going on in these seemingly ideal small towns. But obviously we're here to mostly focus on Lana. So what are your thoughts on Peyton Place and Lana's performance here?
Well, I think if there was a lead actress performance to be nominated from the film, it's not Lana Turner's. I'm not even sure she is lead. I think probably just by star power, she kind of just about gets there. But for me, the soul of the movie was Diane Varsi, who I think is much better. I didn't like Lana Turner in this, I'm sad to say, because I do like her in general, but I just thought she was very wooden. And very closed off. And I get that in some ways that's a part of her character, Connie's character. She's supposed to be a little bit of a cold fish. But I think even within that, she doesn't give nearly enough depth to the soap opera that's going on. And there are a lot of juicy things going on, but not a lot of depth from Turner for me. So sad to say I didn't like her in this. I liked the movie, though.
What were your favorite parts of the film? Because there's a lot going on here.
My favourite part of the film, because this is so trashy, but it's so fun. Like, there's all these mega serious issues in the film, but it's very, very fun. So much sexual repression. And there's a sequence in which Connie is told that Allison and Norman have been seen skinny dipping. And it just descends into utter melodrama with the reveal that Allison's shock horror, an illegitimate child. And you think, you know, that's been quite enough drama for one frame, and then it turns out there's a woman hanging dead upstairs. Like,
Yep.
I mean, I just can't with this movie. It's wild, such a wild ride, but so eager to deliver, I think, on the level of small town drama that I can't help but like it. And it's definitely a satire, and it did come in an era in America where there was moral panic about what are our teenagers getting up to, and it's tapping into that in quite an interesting way, not a hugely deep way, but a way that makes its point quite concisely, I think.
Yeah. I don't know where I read this, but someone said that this feels like an entire season of a primetime soap opera condensed into 2.5 hours. Which I think is fair. But I really actually like Lana Turner here. I don't think this is an all-time performance by any means, but she really weirdly fits into the ensemble well, which I think is what this is. It's a true ensemble film, and I think she doesn't really have enough to justify a lead placement here other than being the top billed star. You know, that's just the kind of thing that was done in these days. She's the biggest name of the cast at the time. But yeah, obviously, if anyone's a lead of the film, it's Diane Varsi, who plays Allison. Yeah. She narrates the film. A lot of it's told from her perspective. But then also, to be fair, she does kind of disappear randomly towards the end and then comes back towards the end again. But yeah, I don't know if there even is a definitive lead per se. I think if this were modern times, I think Lana Turner could maybe get away with campaigning and supporting, and who knows, maybe even have a decent shot of winning. I don't know. But I think her storyline is compelling in parts, but other times I think it feels like it's in its own movie entirely. Like, especially when we get into everything that happens with Selena and her stepfather, and she can kind of feel overshadowed for me. She sort of has to operate as this stoic matriarch type that we saw, you know, people like Claudette Colbert and Irene Dunn or Jane Wyman play that kind of part in the past. You know, someone who's sensible and has to keep it all together even when their life is kind of falling apart. It's kind of a familiar character. And like in some of those cases, there's a depth to those actresses, and they can bring a sort of more reserved character like this that, you know, showing the life experience of having gone through all of that to life. Unfortunately, I don't know if Lana Turner is necessarily that actress. I do know she had been through a lot in her personal life. I'm not dismissing that aspect, but I don't really find the character to be all that interesting to watch for me. You know, she owns a dress shop. She has a complicated relationship with her daughter. She has a romance with this new guy in town. And there are ways to show how this character's gone through a lot of pain and struggle in her life, but I don't really think that she does that. I think she suits the material perfectly fine. It's not like she embarrasses herself. It's just, I'm a little confused about where this nomination comes from.
Yeah, I do like her in general as an actress, but it's just, I think it's a bit like Nancy Kelly the year before this. It's sort of where has the performance got to go? Like, I think even with the so-called showcase scenes, like the breakdown on the witness stand at the trial, to me that was kind of badly played. Like hysteria, and she's supposed to have a kind of an arc because, you know, she's supposed to learn how to understand Allison or converge towards her, and yet there's not much of a journey there within the performance that you can see. So I'm kind of left wondering why, you know, I think this is a performance that's nominated based on the fact that the film had a lot of fans and obviously got a lot of nominations. But it's a bit of a disgrace that she was nominated for this and not for Imitation of Life a couple of years later. Because I'm not a huge Pillow Talk fan, so for that to be nominated over Lana Turner, I think it feels very lightweight and undeserved to me. And also The Bad and the Beautiful, I thought she was brilliant there. Yeah. And the movie won 5 Oscars, and yet the Academy somehow didn't think she was better than Susan Hayward in With a Song in My Heart. So it's a little bit This is an example of somebody being nominated for not their best work. I don't think she's
Yeah.
awful. It's just she doesn't color the performance with enough for me. But
Yeah. Again, it's like when you look at this performance, you don't see a bad performance per se. She's not hamming it up. She's not totally underplaying it too much. It's just like on par with what the material is, I would say. And that's part of why it's like not particularly outstanding for me what she's doing. It's just kind of suiting what the material is. She's decently fine in her chemistry with this new guy, Rossi, who I don't think was particularly great, that actor, personally, but kind of a weird vibe going on there. I think her conversations with her daughter are certainly the showcase for her, where she's having to navigate a lot and having to withhold the truth from her daughter for so long. I think that aspect of it is her best material, and the most that she comes alive in the film is when she's in those conversations and arguments with her daughter.
yeah,
But otherwise she just kind of like fades into the rest of whatever's going on at Peyton Place, and that's it, which I think is fine for what it is. Like I said, it's an ensemble film. She doesn't stick out unnaturally. It's not like this star vehicle necessarily. So it's good that she doesn't stand out particularly in that way. But at the same time, I wish that she popped a little more. Like it's a little imbalanced, I guess.
yeah. And I
So,
think even the reaction to Selena telling her that she's actually like murdered a stepdad, like you'd think she just told her, the kettle's boiled or something. Like
yeah.
it wasn't big enough. It wasn't like whoa, she didn't even sit down. So it just, I don't know, it just didn't fit together for me. But she wasn't as bad as Arthur Kennedy. My God, like of all because Peyton Place got 5 acting nominations, which only
Yeah.
9 films have ever, which is
Didn't
insane.
win any of them. I know.
But Arthur Kennedy's just awful. Like, I think one of the biggest Oscar mysteries is how Arthur Kennedy managed to get 5 Oscar nominations. Because
Yeah.
he's pretty good in Champion, I'll give him that. But apart from that, it's pretty unimpressive. And in this, he's just terribly over the top as this drunk janitor stepdad. It's very cartoonish villain.
Yeah. Very.
And there's no attempt to add any layers to that. And he's beyond over the top. But I think Diane Varsi is great. I think Russ Tamblyn gives a lovely performance. And there's a very clear journey within the performance from the beginning to when he meets Allison on the train in his Navy uniform and the confidence that he's gained. And I thought Hope Lang was also pretty good as well. So for me, it wasn't the experienced actors that held it together. For me, it was the young people, the young actors that held it together.
Yeah. I don't know why I'm just thinking of a comparison to Glee in that respect. It's like you tune in to watch the kid performers, and the kid performers were more interesting than some of the adults. That's how this also felt to me as well. So I mean, I personally preferred Hope Lang to Diane Varsi. I think Hope Lang obviously gets the more concrete, more affecting journey in the end, and really is quite powerful, especially towards the end when it becomes like a courtroom drama suddenly at the end. Those moments are really good for her, and she conveys the fear and the trepidation that she feels, and especially in contrast with what Diane Varsi is giving and not having the privilege to not go through what Selena's gone through. It's interesting to sort of compare and contrast those two characters, but unfortunately that's not what we're here to do. We're here to talk about Lana Turner. I guess for me the best sequence is just the one that is the most obvious, which is where Connie finally is admitting to her daughter that her father was already married when they had an affair and that she is an illegitimate child, quote unquote. And you really are finally feeling all of the pent up emotion and all of the shame that she's been feeling. It's all really spilling out of her in that moment. So I think that's really good. And I think when Allison says that she wants to go away, run away to New York, and she says this really vicious line to her mother where she says that perhaps she'll live off of men like her mother has. I was like, oh shit. Wow. Okay. It's just like this dagger to her heart. And she just like staggers down the stairs. I think that whole sequence was the most that I enjoyed this Lana Turner performance for me.
There's also one where Allison says, I'll run off and become some man's mistress, and she slaps her.
Yep.
That was definitely bringing the camp value. All of those scenes. The court case, because the film has a lot of issues. But I think the court case and the murder is maybe a step too far for the movie. I think it's quite functional because it cleverly sort of unites all of the characters because they all have to come back to the town. But you get this with a lot of the old melodramas, a lot from the 30s actually, where they feel like they've got to have a climactic court case to sort of amp up the drama. And I think we could have done without the trial. And how militant is the doctor? This doctor in the movie, falsifies the hospital records and then sort of browbeats Lucas into signing a confession. For me, that didn't ring true. I don't think anyone would do that or have the foresight to do that.
Yeah, and then sort of to have that turn around in the end and have him judging everyone else for their behavior. It's like, well, maybe let's look in the mirror a little bit and see what we're doing. Obviously, he has good intentions and probably the right intentions in terms of not wanting to ruin this girl's, life in the end, but still a little bit hypocritical, I found in the end. But in terms of the final courtroom scene where she's on the stand, the only thing that I found to be a standout for Lana is the discussion of whether Allison would have told her about anything that she saw of Selena being beaten. And she knows that her daughter did come to her and bring certain problems home with her, but that Connie herself, she was kind of cold to her and dismissive. I thought that moment was pretty effective, and you feel just like everything suddenly rushing to her in that moment, like, oh wow, I've been hypocritical in my way as well. So that's an effective moment. But otherwise, I think it's meant to feel like a more climactic moment of revelation for that character that doesn't quite get there, whether through the writing or through the performance. It just kind of lays there a little bit. So I was disappointed in the end with that. But
I think, like we mentioned with Raintree County, everything didn't coalesce right.
Right.
Which was also kind of this bloated small town drama, like Peyton Place. But I think to give Peyton Place its credit, it's a lot better thought out, and it keeps circling back to ideas it's brought up earlier on. There are times where seemingly small moments resurface, like when Mrs. Thornton, I think Mildred Dunnett was lovely in the film.
Yes.
Where she's turned down or overlooked for the principal position. She says to Allison, sometimes a person doesn't get what she deserves. Don't wait for someone to reward you. Go out and get what you want. And eventually Allison does that. And when she does that, it's not emphasized. It just happens. So I think that moment is revisited in a way that's quite cathartic for that character and an interesting story beat for the movie. So I think in many ways it's actually very well thought out as a story. Some of it's repetitive, especially with Connie and Allison's fights. They're just the same fights over and over again, really. But there were thoughtful flourishes in there too. So every time I've seen the movie, I've liked it more than the time before. So this is the third time. So I think to be honest, it's a really good Best Picture lineup. But this isn't out of place, I don't think, within that.
Yeah. And I think, speaking to, again, the Raintree County comparison, I think it has a very solid grasp of what the tone is and what it should be, and it is effective in creating that particular kind of soapy kind of tone, but still honoring these characters and their true feelings, and you feel them as characters more so than just play acting like I saw in Raintree County. You feel them really transform into these people because, again, I mean, a lot of the younger people hadn't really done much acting before this, if at all. So obviously audiences in 1957 were being introduced to most of those cast members, but I think they all really fall into place well, and it feels right as like that close-knit small town. Like you have all the different archetypes, and most of the people, I would say, are creating a three-dimensional view of their characters. I would agree that Arthur Kennedy is not.
Yeah.
But for the most part, it makes sense to me that this is a property that would ultimately be spun off into its own soap opera, because there's a lot of potential in all these different stories. So,
and the movie looks good as well.
Does.
It looks a lot better than Raintree County. So.
Yeah, ironically. Yeah. All right. Well, that's pretty much all I have on Lana Turner. I mean, happy that she's an Oscar nominee in the end, because she was, an important person of her time. It's just, I would agree that it's probably not her best.
It's not a hugely strong year for people that have been snubbed and things like that either, so it's not as if she's taken the place of anyone else.
All right. Well, shall we get to our winner?
Let's.
All right. Joanne Woodward for The Three Faces of Eve. So I would say that it's pretty good timing to finally be talking about Joanne Woodward this year after the release of The Last Movie Stars, the documentary series on HBO Max, which really, I think, opened up people's eyes to Joanne Woodward, especially in how underrated she is, especially in comparison to everyone knows Paul Newman, her husband. Highly recommend people check that out if you haven't already. But before this, Joanne had done stage work. She met Paul Newman when they were appearing together in Picnic. She did TV shows. She did only 2 other films before this, but in a lot of different respects, I think The Three Faces of Eve was considered her major mainstream breakthrough, the thing that really cemented her as an actress who was in it for the long haul. So this was a very tough role to cast because the original plan was to have an A-list star in the role. Jennifer Jones was in the mix. She was terrified of taking it on, so she passed. June Allison passed. They did go to Judy Garland, who was interested, but then she backed out. So then it became clear to Nunnally Johnson, the producer, that they had to go with it unknown, someone who was ready to prove herself. And he discovered Joanne Woodward in one of her TV appearances. She was also scared of the role, but she pushed past that, and obviously the rest is history. So The Three Faces of Eve, it's loosely based on the real life case of a woman who had dissociative identity disorder. At the time, it was called multiple personality disorder. So Joanne plays Eve White, who is a housewife with a husband and a daughter, but she keeps having these headaches and is displaying some erratic behavior, including strangling her daughter. Come to find out, Eve slips into another personality, Eve Black, who is much more bold than Eve White, more seductive, more confident, and her doctor tries to figure out how to help her. That's more or less the film in a nutshell. But let's talk Joanne Woodward. What are your thoughts on her as an actress, and what do you think of her in her Oscar-winning performance?
I like her as an actress, especially in Rachel. I think she's amazing. But I think I read that because Orson Welles was in the frame to play Lee J. Cobb's character, and apparently he read the script and said whoever's going to play the lead will win the Oscar. And
his mind
prophetic. But I don't think it's that prophetic because it's certainly a performance, like in all caps. That Joanne Woodward is giving in this movie, and in fact, you could even argue it's 3 performances, really. It's an impressive trick, I think, to be able to fall in and out of each character, and she definitely perfects it as it goes along. But side by side with that, I think there's a problem that you can see the mechanics of her overall performance quite clearly, and sometimes it can tend to feel like when you get like a drama class warm-up where you've got like a teacher shouting, act shy, act like a harlot, act this, act that. And the suddenness of the transitions, I think, draw attention to the artificiality of the performance in a way Woodward can't fully control, just by nature of what the performance is asking of her. I thought she was really good, but there's an element for me that I can't fully buy into it because of the way it's the mechanisms at play.
Yeah, I definitely understand what you're saying there. I'm, first of all, just excited to be talking about Joanne Woodward, even though her Oscar trajectory is very off and on. You know, she gets 4 nominations, but she only really gets nominated like every 5 or 10 years at a time. So it wasn't like what we saw sometimes where, you know, obviously Deborah Kerr getting nominated a bunch at this one point in time. And I do think it's a testament to her ability to keep putting in great work and varied performances, because there's very few performances that she's put in quite like this, for example. She gets, I think, more nuanced and subtler over time, you could say. And I think, you know, she's very down to earth and very grounded as a performer more often than not. And I think is very much at this sort of 50s transition point of more naturalistic acting, really putting a lot of thought into her characters and really inhabiting them. And obviously that's what this role is all about. You know, I think on some level the role itself is just so meaty, just as you're kind of saying, as an acting exercise, that you could almost argue that she has an unfair advantage over the other nominees here, because it's just so overt what she's doing. But at the same time, I think if you have an actress in this role who isn't up for the task, then this is probably a disaster and it doesn't even get nominated.
Yeah.
I think she brings a good amount of pathos to the role without really mugging for the camera in certain respects in a way that feels vain, like look at me, like you can imagine like another actress might do. I think she's fully committed to this character and the different personalities, giving each of them a very different way of speaking, but feeling believable in the 3 versions of whatever she's doing in the present. You know, the switches themselves, I think, are a little pronounced, you know, but I understand, you know, audiences at the time hadn't really known much about this disorder, so we have like the music changes and everything that are a little clunky. But I think it's safe to say that she pretty much carries this film on her shoulders. It's just one of those films that we come across in Best Actress where the lead actress's performance is pretty much the reason to watch it, more or less.
And the only thing that's celebrated about it as well.
It is, yes. I looking at the IMDb awards for this movie, it's literally only her.
Yeah.
So, yeah, it's just like, it's obviously a film itself, and its construction is completely and totally a vehicle for the performance. And I think as a film, it's fine. It's flawed in a few ways, but she does, for me, carry it all the way from beginning to end. And yeah, there's not a lot else to recommend about the film.
I think it's difficult to imagine somebody else being much better.
Yeah.
And it fits very nicely into this common Best Actress nominated movie trope where it's about curing the woman of her trauma.
Yeah.
Very much like what you talked about already, Possessed, The Snake Pit, Johnny Belinda, things like that. And I thought it was pretty feminist on the whole. I think the way that the relationship between Eve and Ralph disintegrates feels quite genuine. And I can imagine a lot of people at this time would be reluctant or unable to understand the illness and would approach the issue in the same way that Ralph does.
Yeah.
But what did put me off a little bit was at the beginning there's this extremely formal introduction, which is a bit like what you get at the beginning of an episode of the old Twilight Zone series, which is amazing.
Yeah, pretty much.
Where some bloke is telling us we're about to see this strange story based on true events from 1951. And it's very much, you know, it's laying out its stall as if Eve is this curio of sorts, which I think speaks a lot to the attitude towards mental health in this period, because this is an era in which people are only just beginning to try to understand mental imbalances and treat people as ill rather than locking them up in the sanitarium or whatever. But you'd think from that intro that we were about to see a horror film. It was very sensationalist, and I think it exposed how insensitive society was to this kind of sickness, I think, at the time.
Mm-hmm. And probably on some level still is, to be fair. But I think in terms of the emotion of each character, I think she nails exactly what is on the page and excels that. And obviously it's these three different archetypes in some respect. Eve White is this very vulnerable and put upon kind of housewife and is just traumatized by what she feels like she doesn't understand is happening within herself because her husband is telling her that she's doing these things, but she doesn't even know that she's switching into other personalities as Eve White. And then Eve Black is just this more like Blanche Dubois type character, is just very like overtly sexual and all of this. And she really kind of hams it up in those moments, but it never feels like it's going too over the top for me. And then towards the end, when we have her becoming the other character,
Jane.
which is Jane, she drops the southern accent that she had with Eve White and Eve Black, and I think it's quite probably jarring for an audience to recognize her in a different light, and you feel like in a strange way, just based on her behavior, that she really is transforming into three different people. You know, it's like how certain people can do impressions of, celebrities and things. And like suddenly when they do a really good impression, it's like, wow, you just totally channeled this other being completely. Like the person I thought you were just disappeared into this other thing. That's kind of how this feels. And on that respect, obviously it's incredibly flashy and overt as a performance.
Yeah.
That it's very obvious that this would win over this lineup. But at the same time, I do think that she put a lot of thought and understanding into tracking each of these characters and exactly how they would be behaving in a scene, that it doesn't feel like too gimmicky to me, even though I would sort of agree that you can sense the mechanics going on here more so than in some of her other performances later on. It's just that's what the role is and that's what the material is that's on the page. So she can't help but have to work within those confines, I suppose.
Yeah, I can't see a version of this film being made that the performance at the center of it wasn't a bit gimmicky. It's a bit gimmicky.
Right.
It is a little bit, but she softens it. And I did find the whole Eve White Black thing a bit on the nose, but I think it might have made more of an impact if the original personality wasn't such a wet wipe of a woman. I feel like Eve White needs to be a little bit less pathetic.
Yeah, but that's the part that's a little too overdone of the three. Yeah, I would agree.
Yeah, but I appreciate the illness itself might be getting her down and she's downtrodden and things like that.
Yeah.
But Eve Black is the showcase for Woodward, and I think it's testament to her performance that when Eve Black cries at the end, you know which character it is that's crying. Without her having to say anything. So that's really clever. And I don't know if they filmed this in sequence, but it definitely, for me, it gets better as it goes, the performance, and it gets more seamless, as if she's really gotten into it so much that it's like second nature at this point. So
yeah.
I want to give a shout out to Kira Sedgwick. This is random. I don't know if you're an Annie McBeal fan, but in one of the episodes, Kira Sedgwick plays a woman with multiple personality disorder. And it's like, because it's like a legal drama, it's about one personality against the other or whatever. And she's so terrific in it, and so subtle. So it's interesting because we don't get many performances to do with multiple personality disorder. I think Sybil with Sally Field's extraordinary in that. But yeah, Kira Sedgwick amazing in that episode. So there are comparisons to be made in terms of who's done it better, this kind of performance. But there's no denying that Joanne Woodward is the first, I think, to have even tackled this. So I think on that basis, she deserves a lot of credit, and she's really good in the movie. It's a Best Actress win. It's definitely a good Best Actress win. I can't deny that.
And I think in the respect of what you're saying, her being the first to really do it, I give her a little bit of slack if some of it feels a little obvious in retrospect.
Yeah.
I would imagine, in 1957, this would feel quite striking and almost revolutionary what she's doing here. what do you think of just kind of the final breakthrough moment where we have her going to get a ball underneath the house for her kid, and it triggers this memory of her childhood, and she just kind of relives it in the moment in the doctor's office, just realizing how this all came about, all the different personalities stemming back from her childhood where she had to like kiss her dead grandmother.
Well, it wasn't traumatic enough, really. I don't think to warrant the whole illness.
Yeah, I felt bad thinking that as well, but I was like, it feels a little mild.
Yeah, because kids have done this before. They used to do open caskets all the time, right? And in the old days.
Yeah.
So
yeah,
that for me, I mean, I imagine that's based on the true story. But it might be that there's something else that triggered that the actual woman doesn't remember or is blocked out or whatever.
Right.
But I think the problem with the ending overall, I think it feels very predictable because they start to signpost it very early on. Eve White says at one point, if one of us survives, I hope it's Jane. And we've got the voiceover coming before the last consultation where it says, this is the day that Eve White died. And, I don't understand why the filmmakers thought it necessary to inform us what was going to happen before it happened and can't just trust us to get its points through experiencing it in the moment. So I know a lot of the dialogue is taken from the actual case records, and the dialogue generally is actually pretty good. But I think the film wanted to hold our hand too much, I think, and treat it as a bit of a case study where I'm not sure it needed to be presented that way.
Yeah, I agree. I think the clinical aspect of it feels, once again, very studio note driven. Like, we have to help audiences along to make them a little more comfortable and get used to what this performance is going to be. And so, yeah, I don't love that aspect of it because I feel like she does enough just in what her performance is that we don't need all of that.
Yeah.
So that's unfortunate. But I think by the end, her having the breakthrough moment, it's all kind of crashing down on her all at once. I think it's a really impactful moment for her that you can just tell, like, once that final scene comes along of that breakthrough, that sort of eureka moment, I think that's like the Oscars right there.
Yeah.
In a way.
Yeah.
So I think on that we can sort of transfer into talking about the Oscar race itself and why Joanne won. It's definitely an interesting race because from what I read, this was a case of most of the nominees having a pretty plausible narrative behind them to maybe help propel them to a win. I don't know exactly what you've read about just the lay of the race itself, but obviously Joanne had this towering performance and the fact that she more or less came out of nowhere. Deborah was a 4-time nominee here. I did read that Barbara Stanwyck actively campaigned for her.
Oh, wow.
Which is really sweet.
Oh, that's nice.
Yeah. 2 robbed Oscar bridesmaids supporting each other. We love that. Lana Turner and Elizabeth Taylor both kind of had a narrative, at least in the media, of, putting in a lot of mileage as movie stars, and Elizabeth Taylor finally being taken seriously. Lana Turner, more or less the same. Anna Magnani really didn't have a campaign, like we said. She's the only one who didn't really have like a concrete narrative behind her, at least in the press. Although she might have just gotten votes just from continued respect for this actress.
Yeah.
Did you read anything else about what was going on with the race this year?
I mean, only what's in Inside Oscar, and
yeah, that's where I got most of this.
It seemed pretty effusive that Joanne Woodward was a heavy favourite, and I think often with the Oscars they tend to go with most is best, and this performance being 3 performances in a way. I know it's, it is, they do coalesce, but I think that's helped her. I think the novelty of the topic, I think, would have helped to stand out. But it's interesting that her film, as we mentioned earlier, was the only one not to get a nomination in any other category. And yet she won, which does sometimes happen. Happened with Still Alice fairly recently. But I think, obviously, all of the attention with regard to the film was focused on her achievements. And she is good. So in the grand scheme of things, it's a good Best Actress win. I think this was a cakewalk for her, honestly.
I would say so. Although she did have a rather spicy comment, which I'm sure you also read, that we don't often see from actresses on like an Oscar campaign, where she said, "If I had an infinite amount of respect for the people who think I gave the greatest performance, then it would matter."
Mm.
Which is to say that she maybe didn't have the greatest respect for the voters of the Oscars and who they typically would choose. We very rarely see a comment like that, I would say, then or now. So I kind of love the sort of whatever, I gave my performance. If they see fit that I like, that I was good, then they can vote for me. It's not going to end my world either way, you know? It is what it is.
Well, I think
So,
mostly in the past it's been men, hasn't it, saying those comments?
Yeah. Right.
Or recently, I think Kristen Stewart said she didn't give a shit about the Oscars, and then they nominated her anyway. So it's kind of like, I don't know if they're even aware of that. But
yeah, who knows? It was reported on in the press, but sometimes maybe even they like that more. They like that that some people don't want it too much. You know, that whole thing.
although
That's
in
why
the
they've
case
given
of
Frances McDormand 3 Oscars for acting. You know, she doesn't give a shit, and yet they keep giving it to her anyway.
yeah,
Same with Katharine Hepburn.
yeah, it's true.
But in terms of precursors, Joanne did win the Golden Globe. She also won National Board of Review, but we had a different winner at New York Film Critics. Deborah Kerr won there, so maybe she could have pulled off a little insurgent campaign if people didn't want to vote for Joanne or didn't, you know, she was too new. Deborah was certainly established at this point. She obviously had other actors campaigning for her, like Barbara Stanwyck, so that was a possibility. But later on, we'll be discussing who we think was the real runner-up here, because again, it could have been more or less anyone, I would argue, because I would agree that Joanne Woodward was far out in front.
It's a tough one in terms of runner-up, I think, yeah.
Well, let's get to some questions.
Okay.
Christoph N. said, as a set, is this the most underwhelming group of films you have encountered in quite a while on your journey through the nominees? For me, a little underwhelming. Mostly, I, again, just kind of felt a little depressed after watching a lot of these because there isn't like a super fun performance. It's, again, a lot of women going through the ringer, but not in a particularly entertaining way for the most part. So a little bit difficult to get through, but not the most underwhelming, I would say, for me.
I mean, it's definitely underwhelming in the sense that there isn't a performance among them, I would say, you know, is really excellent. So it's underwhelming in
or
that
iconic,
sense.
right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
But I think there are 3 good performances, so it could be worse. I think 1949 is bleak from memory.
Oh my God. Yes.
Jan Crane's mixed race role, just so misjudged. But yeah, underwhelming, but not awful.
Yeah. Fritz said, Joanne Woodward, like Julie Christie, won her Oscar for her first showy role and then got further nominations for more subtle work. Do you prefer Joanne loud or quiet? I think she does both pretty well, but on the whole, probably the quiet performances carry a little more weight for me with her.
Yeah, I much prefer her quiet work. I think everyone goes on about Barbara Streisand and Katharine Hepburn in 1968, but I would have given the Oscar to Joanne Woodward in a heartbeat. And Rachel is a beautiful film, beautifully directed film. And she and Estelle Parsons, who I really didn't like Estelle Parsons in her Oscar win for Bonnie and Clyde, but I think those two are both wonderful in the film. So that's a must-watch for actress fans.
I agree. I really love that performance from her, and that movie is so underrated. Yeah. So very excited to get to that pretty soon, actually. Fritz also asked, apparently Judy Garland was offered the script for Eve. Do you think she could have pulled it off?
I mean, I don't think there's much Judy Garland couldn't pull off, honestly. I'm kind of wanting to watch that version with Judy Garland, but yeah, of course she could. Right? She could do anything, Judy Garland.
Yeah, I think yes, but I do think also having Judy Garland in the role would have been distracting, maybe, compared to someone like Joanne Woodward, who was very new at the time. So that's the only reason I would maybe think of not casting her there, but otherwise, yeah, I definitely want to see what her version of this material.
I think also Judy Garland would have been older, right? So
yeah,
would it have been interesting to see the movie from a woman in her 30s rather than her 20s?
But one more from Fritz. Is Three Faces of Eve the silliest movie with a Best Actress winning performance you've seen so far? Not for me. That would be Coquette.
Yeah, it's got to be, hasn't it?
Sorry to Mary Pickford. Yes.
Yeah, Coquette's awful.
Silly movie, silly performance. Sorry, Mary. Love you in other things, but talkies were not it for you, unfortunately.
But she founded the Oscars, so we love her.
Yeah, right. That's true. Emily said, did Joanne Woodward's homemade dress deserve to be dragged by Joan Crawford like it was? She said, I'm biased, but I think it's pretty.
I mean, I was sad to learn this.
Yeah.
No, it didn't deserve to be dragged. And I love Joan Crawford. Her performance in Autumn Leaves would be top 5 ever for me. But we know that Joan Crawford was problematic as a person and a total snob. And there was some quote I read a couple of years ago where she's saying, oh, I wouldn't want any hippies coming in my house with dirty feet or something. So the idea of like making your own clothes, I could imagine she didn't like. But the dress itself is, I think, a beautiful shade of green and fits her well enough. So I think power to Joanne. Honestly, I thought it was lovely.
Yeah, I read she made it for like $100, and it's like comparable to any other Oscar dress out there. I mean, it doesn't look like particularly expensive, but she looks good. She looks fine. Like, it's not like an all-time dress necessarily, but not worth the dragging. No.
And also it speaks to her modesty as well. It's probably a sign that she was actually quite a down-to-earth person.
Right. And similarly, Sophia Simonello said, Woodward famously made her own gown to wear to the ceremony. What are some of your favorite Oscar looks worn by Best Actress winners?
I thought Cate Blanchett looked beautiful when she won for Blue Jasmine and gave a typically dignified speech and did everything right. And that's such a great win. I remember when the movie came out, I think it came out in September, and I went to see it and said to my friend, I think we've just seen the Best Actress winner, and we both agreed. But, you know, sometimes you just watch something and you just know that nobody's beating that. And I think that's probably a case with Joanne Woodward as well. But yeah, that was a great outfit. And Diane Keaton's Oscar outfit, just bonkers. But, you know, I love Diane and I love her original taste and that she doesn't conform to the glamour girl molds. So that was nice.
I really love Marion Cotillard's mermaid dress.
Yeah.
I love that look. I like Julie Christie's kind of gold jumpsuit. It's very 60s. Cher, obviously, and Bob Mackie is always phenomenal. I know it's kind of cursed at this point, but Meryl Streep's gold dress when she won for the Iron Lady is arguably the best she's ever looked on a red carpet. So I would throw in her too.
I almost said Meryl Streep actually, but I'm not sure it fit properly. But I agree, it's one of the best she's ever looked. She's not exactly known for her fashion, really.
Yeah, she's like, I'm dressed to win, and she did. Yeah, but again, nobody wear gold dresses anymore. That's cursed now.
After Glenn.
Yes, exactly. And Carey Mulligan, Andra Day, both wore gold, both lost. So, yeah. Anyway, Fritz said, do you prefer Heaven Knows or The African Queen, which are both so similar? African Queen for me.
Yeah, definitely.
It's just kind of more fun to watch.
Yeah.
And has less of that downtime.
Yeah, it doesn't sag, does it? African Queen, it carries on through.
Yeah, it moves. It really moves. Christoph said, why do I feel like asking, is this the closest Deborah Kerr was to winning yet again? How does it feel like she was the runner-up so often? Well, I'm not going to say one way or the other if she was the runner-up here, but it does always feel like one of those things where it feels like she was always on the cusp, that the Academy just didn't think that there was a performance that was like the one. Like, this is finally her time, weirdly.
I mean, I think, how much do we attribute this to Elizabeth Taylor's health? in 1961. I don't know.
Yeah.
Would that have been an option, or would that have been Shirley MacLaine? It's kind of unclear. I think it's between this, The King and I, and The Sundowners would be the three I would say she would be closest to winning, because I don't think anyone was beating Audrey Hepburn for Roman Holiday, unfortunately. But yeah, it's potentially, but we'll get to it later.
Taya also said, I've seen some say this is the closest Deborah Kerr came to winning. Do you think that's true? And if not, which year does she come the closest? Again, not going to say that yet, but I think she was probably closer for The King and I would say, last year.
Yeah,
that would be my guess.
It's difficult because that whole Ingrid Bergman comeback narrative is very strong. And
I know.
Even though she's frankly not very good in the movie, and the movie's like really stodgy, and it was very, very, it seemed like it was a big media thing, so I don't know how close she could have been, but I suppose Yul Brynner won, so
yeah. And it's the Best Picture nominee, did pretty well. Joey Gentili said, personally, I think Anna's better of her two performances is here. Do you think had the Academy had a crystal ball, they would have held off her win for Rose Tattoo for her much better work this year? No. I think they'd be happy with rewarding Anna when they did, so that they could reward Joanne when they did here. I think they're fine with how this played out, personally. What do you think?
I think yes. I mean, I think I've already said this. It would have been nice for Susan Hayward to have won for I'll Cry Tomorrow, and Magnani to win for this performance, which I really like. And then, who knows, maybe Rosalind Russell would have finally gotten her Oscar for Auntie Mame. I don't know, but...
That's an interesting narrative. Yeah, I like that alternate history. I just don't think the Academy felt that way. But personally, yeah, I would like to see that narrative.
Or maybe Deborah Kerr gets her Oscar for Separate Tables, but probably not.
Yeah, probably not, right? Miles McHale said, why did this become Liz's first nomination when she was right there in A Place in the Sun?
You can start with this, because I'm not a huge fan of hers in that movie particularly, but...
Well, yeah, I mean, I think she still just wasn't taken seriously at that time. I think the nature of the part was not particularly showy as a performance necessarily compared to Shelley Winters. So that's what I would say in terms of Place in the Sun.
I think Andrew Carden might want to mute the next few seconds, but I really can't stand Shelley Winters. And I don't get why she was nominated for A Place in the Sun over Elizabeth Taylor. Having said that, I think there were better options than Taylor in 1951. People like Ida Lupino in On Dangerous Ground comes to mind. But there are other options, so I don't think she should have been nominated until Cat on a Hot Tin Roof.
David Pusak said, as someone who considers Raintree County as a guilty pleasure, would you call it something of a camp classic or an unfortunate train wreck?
Can it be a camp train wreck?
Yeah, a little bit of everything there. I lean more towards train wreck personally, but I could see some camp value in it too.
I think it's fundamentally misjudged, but I think it's got a lot of camp value with the dolls and the mania, and the fact that it's got two gay icons in Clifton Taylor as well. But yeah.
Luke Val said, did Taylor's nom have anything to do with being the only one of the main cast from Giant to get snubbed the year before? Or was the period melodrama of it all too baity for the Academy to resist? I mean, I don't think the Giant snub was necessarily a thing in the way that some snubs can be like, oh God, how did they not get nominated for that? But I do think her just being in Giant helped to propel her to be taken more seriously as an actress.
Yeah, I can see maybe people at the time saying she's going to get nominated, and then Katharine Hepburn gets nominated for The Rainmaker, which, a way sort of more understated movie that didn't get nominations really. But I don't think necessarily. I think it's more the fact that she was in the conversation and people were beginning to talk her up for awards at this point, at this stage in her career, and a lot of media interest. And I think it was always coming that she was going to get major nominations and major roles.
Right. Sammy Flowers said, considering the movie is a slog with a 10% Rotten Tomatoes score, how much of Taylor's nomination do you consider stems from sympathy votes for what she had to go through during filming? Which is the Clift accident, tachycardia. Probably helped a little bit, but if that were the case, I think maybe show some sympathy to Monty too, but he's not nominated, so.
Well, I've had tachycardia and it's not very nice, but it's not the worst thing in the world, and you're not at death's door. So,
yeah,
I don't know. I think it's the same. I think her reputation was rising. A lot of people would have read the book and thought Suzanne as a character that was going to allow her moments to shine, and I think that will have helped. And again, as mentioned earlier, not exactly strong on the ground in terms of the best actress race and possible alternatives.
Right. Christopher Perkins said Diane Varsi received a supporting actress nomination for Peyton Place, but do you think it's reasonable to suggest she's actually lead? If so, would you have nominated her alongside Lana Turner?
Instead of, for me.
Not alongside, but instead of.
Instead of, and I think it would have been a good nomination as well. I just thought she gave something to that, a lot of soul to the performance that somebody else wouldn't have done. So yeah, I'd be on board with that completely, but instead of, not alongside.
Like we were saying, I think, yeah, if anyone is the lead of Peyton Place, it's her. I don't think I would have nominated her, but it's a decent performance. Miles McHale said Peyton Place was a scandalous bestseller, became a hit with 9 nominations, and a real-life tabloid story with Lana Turner. How did a true cultural phenomenon not garner a single Oscar, especially Hope Lang? I think Hope Lang was probably the best bet for a win, to be honest, but I'm not going to take away that Oscar from Miyoshi Umeki. I think it's just one of those films where it's easy to rack up a lot of nominations, but tough to actually win, considering the competition. Kind of like, what American Hustle, like that kind of thing.
Yeah, it's a bit odd, but I think when a film gets 9 nominations, how big of an indication is it that of support, because it might have been that it's been 4th or 5th on everyone's ballot in every category.
Yeah. Right.
So also it lost to Bridge Over the River Kwai in like a lot of categories, so which is a brilliant film that I love. So it's just tough luck, really.
Right, exactly. Fritz said other nominations you would have liked for Lana Turner. I mean, Postman Always Rings Twice is an obvious one for me personally. Like you said earlier, I love her in Imitation of Life, which is a few years after this, I believe. So, yeah, that's what I would say.
Yeah, same. As I mentioned before, she's dynamite in The Bad and the Beautiful as well in 1952.
Right. Yeah, that too.
Imitation of Life. I haven't seen The Postman Always Rings Twice, but I've heard good things.
So just to get to these final questions here, Fritz said recast the nominated roles with the nominated actresses.
Oh.
A fun creative exercise for us.
Well, wouldn't it have been fun to see Anna Magnani in Raintree County just like playing to the rafters knelt down at the grave,
God. Yeah. I don't know how that would have worked with like her accent and the fact that she's supposed to be from the South, but
and racist.
And racist, yes. So I had to write these down because I had to make it perfect. So here's my combination. Let me know what you think of this.
Okay.
Let's have Deborah Kerr in The Three Faces of Eve.
Okay. Yeah, I can see that.
Yeah. I put Lana Turner in Raintree County. Just because, I don't know, it feels like a 1-to-1 with like glamorous movie stars.
But she's too old.
Well, maybe. I don't know. You can rewrite the character. Elizabeth Taylor in Heaven Knows Mr. Allison. Maybe.
Never played a nun, Elizabeth Taylor, right?
Yeah. No, I don't think so. Would like to see it. Joanne Woodward in Wild as the Wind, even though she's not Italian. So I think that they'd have to change some things. But
I think she'd be great in that. She would be.
Yeah. And then by process of elimination, we're putting Anna Magnani in Peyton Place.
Oof.
Seeing what happens.
Well, definitely a matriarch, I would say. But
yeah. Could see her being very protective of her daughter.
Yeah, I think
that's my combination.
I think I'd go along with Joanne Woodward in Wild as the Wind and Elizabeth Taylor in Heaven Knows Mr. Allison, definitely. Magnani's got to be in Raintree County. That would be insane. And then I might have Deborah Kerr in Peyton Place. That would be interesting.
She could easily pull that off.
Yeah.
Probably give it more depth. Sorry, Lana.
Mm.
Existential Rock said, just for fun, which modern director do you think would have been fun to see direct each of these actresses? Another exercise for us.
Yeah, I didn't get one for each, but I think it would be really fun to watch an Ari Aster directed horror film with Elizabeth Taylor.
Oh my. Wow.
I mean, she would probably end up like not talking to him, like that poor man who directed Butterfield 8 that just didn't deserve that. But anyway, and also Scorsese, I think he would have loved to direct Anna Magnani, given his love of Italian cinema. So that would have been interesting. But his movies don't really have women in. But there you go.
Well, sometimes.
Yeah.
I said for this, I would say, let's do Luca Guadagnino directing Anna Magnani. Italians. I said for Joanne Woodward, Jane Campion.
Nice.
I think would be a good fit. They also, I mean, Joanne Woodward does look like Kirsten Dunst in her younger years, just saying. For Deborah Kerr, I was thinking someone who could play into her darker side, and I went with Yorgos Lanthimos.
Yeah, I can see that, definitely.
Yeah. And then for Elizabeth Taylor, I think leaning into the sort of campiness that she could get into in some of her later years, I thought of Baz Luhrmann.
Or Francois
or maybe
Ozon would be same
yeah.
deal, yeah.
Right. Or Paul Verhoeven.
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah. And then for Lana Turner, I was trying to think of someone like a cool, like noir-ish kind of thing. And I just said David Fincher.
Yeah.
I think they could be interesting together. Who knows?
We'll never know, but we can fantasize.
Yes, exactly. Right. A few more random questions here from Cinema Sex Kitten. They said, December 25th, 1957, the British Royal Christmas Message is televised with the Queen, Elizabeth II, on camera for the first time. Who in 1957 of this lineup could have played Queen Elizabeth in what would have been equivalent to the first season of The Crown? I love this question.
What do you think?
I went with Deborah Kerr.
Yeah, it's got to be, hasn't it? Because she's got the most nobility of any of them. I've just finally managed to start having conversations with people in which the Queen is not mentioned. It's just been insane over here. But
I'm sure.
But yeah, it's got to be Deborah Kerr because she's just there's a certain dignity about her, and also it can't be Elizabeth Taylor because her English accent is dreadful from memory. So.
Yeah, and then I don't really know what Lana Turner would do with that.
No.
I don't think that would fit. And I can't see Anna Magnani pulling that off, so we'll pass on that.
Would be interesting stamp.
Yeah, sure. Taya said, should Marlene Dietrich have gotten a nomination for a witness for the prosecution? I think yes, and I think in supporting, where she was not campaigned.
I could see her in lead, to be honest.
Okay.
I think she deserved a nomination, definitely. And
I mean, either way, I would nominate her in either category, but yeah.
Yeah, and I think like it's really strange that she didn't get one because the film was like all over the Oscars, and yeah, all I can think of is that maybe it was category confusion.
Yeah,
but
well, that's what Andrew Carden is asking: was she justified in going lead?
I would have nominated her in lead, just because it's Marlene Dietrich. I think also she's clearly the most featured actress in the movie. I watched the film last year, and Elsa Lanchester's not in it that much really, especially in the second half. So yeah, I would have given her a nomination. She's very, very good, and it's a really neat trick that she plays that other role within the film.
And then finally, Lucas said, "Where was Audrey Hepburn for Funny Face?" I think that was probably considered too light of a performance compared to all the heavyweight stuff we've got going on here.
Yeah, for me, Funny Face is a bit of a chore. I'd actually point to a better Audrey Hepburn performance from 1957. I actually think it's the best performance of 1957 by an actress, which is in Love in the Afternoon, the Billy Wilder film. in which, I mean, I think anyone deserves an Oscar for pretending to like be in love with a craggy Gary Cooper in 1957. This
Well,
20-year-old
yeah.
woman.
Hmm.
But yeah, no, she's really good in that, and I'm not really a Billy Wilder fan overall, but it's the first time, because I think in the early 50s I'm not a fan of Hepburn in Sabrina and Roman Holiday, and I think it took her till the late 50s to get good. And I like
Hmm.
her in the late 50s and 60s movies a lot, but
Okay, so I thought we're out of questions, so let's get to our final segment here, where we discuss who we think was the runner-up to Joanne Woodward. Callum, what do you think? Who was the runner-up here?
it's a tough one. I don't know if the adulation that Anna Magnani got for her performance in The Rose Tattoo could have spilled over here. There are examples of actresses winning very soon after they first won. Sally Field, Hilary Swank, Louise Rayner. Um, it's possible, but my instinct is that it was Deborah Kerr, given that this was her fourth nomination and the rest of them hadn't had loads of nominations. So she was clearly the seasoned veteran of the field, and she's playing a nun, and we know that the Oscars love nuns historically, and it's an emotional role in a way. So my instinct is Deborah Kerr. I honestly don't know though. What do you
Yeah,
think?
I think it's a tough one, I would say, but I think the fact that Peyton Place had 9 nominations really helped Lana Turner, perhaps. I think the narrative of Elizabeth Taylor being taken seriously now maybe helped propel her a little bit, and it's a very flashy, baity character there. I don't really think Anna Magnani was in the conversation to win again, personally.
Mm,
So that's why I think Deborah Kerr was the runner up as well. I think the fact she won the New York Film Critics, so she certainly had respect there. She had people campaigning for her, like Barbara Stanwyck, and she was indeed the veteran of this group and probably the most respected actress of them all at this time.
definitely. Yeah.
And so I think even though the performance itself isn't particularly flashy in a way that typically wins Best Actress, that I think she still would have probably gotten a sizable amount of votes, maybe not enough to be competitive for the win here, because I think Joanne Woodward just completely overshadows everyone else here in terms of the sheer nature of that performance. But that if there were detractors, I could see people being more swayed to Deborah being more subtle than what Joanne is giving.
Yeah.
So yeah.
So that would be 2 years in a row. She'd be runner up then.
Yeah.
You think?
Yep.
Yeah.
Yep.
Poor Deborah.
We'll see if we say the same thing next year and in 1960. But final question for you: who would you have voted for from this lineup?
I would have voted for Anna Magnani by a country mile. I think it's the performance that's the most natural, that's the most convincing. You can believe in the character, you can believe in the portrayal of the character, and it fit very well with the film and the tone of the film and what the film was going for. Yeah, I loved her. Yeah. How about you?
Well, I will say that Anna Magnani would be my runner-up, and that it is a very close 1 and 2 for me. But that I think probably, even though I don't typically agree with the winner in this particular decade as much, certainly early on I agreed with their picks, but in the middle to end, I definitely am disagreeing a lot with their wins. I do think I would probably just vote for Joanne Woodward. I think it's just she gets so much to do here, and she elevates the material beyond what the film is clearly trying to be, which is like we were saying before, is like very clinical, like looking in on this new disorder that nobody's seen before on film. She has a lot of soul in that performance, even though the nature of it is quite mechanical. I think if I was in 1957 as a voter, I think I'd be very blown away and swept into the narrative of like, who is this really interesting new actress? So I think that would have been the case then for sure. But nowadays, I think looking back on it, it's very close between her and Anna Magnani. But I give Joanne a little bit of an edge just because I like her a little more as an actress.
I think also, like, you see a lot of low grade versions of women, like, sort of struggling through therapy, and there are a lot of worse versions of the film. This is a particularly good version and good performance of this kind of role as well.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So, thank you so much, Cal, for joining me for this. This was a really, really excellent discussion.
Oh, thank you. I've loved it. It's been great.
Yes. Well, tell people where they could find more of you on the internet.
So I co-host a podcast called Categorically Oscars. We're on Twitter at Categorically O, and we talk about a different Oscar category and year every week. So we flit about a bit in time and tone, and so check that out if you want.
Yeah. And if you want to hear more of our discussion, you can listen to that one episode I did.
Yes. Yeah.
Talking about the original song nominees of 1999.
Yeah.
Some fun Phil Collins talk.
Yes, there's a lot of Phil Collins love in the episode.
Yes, surprisingly. Yes. Well, thank you all so much for listening. You can find me on Twitter at Kevin_Jacobson, and the show's at Oscar Runner Up. Instagram and the Runner Up is rate, review, and subscribe if you haven't already. And if you liked what you heard and want to hear more, go to patreon.com/andtherunnerup where you could hear a whole bunch of bonus episodes. And next week, we'll be covering the 1958 Best Actress race, where the nominees were Susan Hayward for I Want to Live, Deborah Kerr for Separate Tables, Shirley MacLaine for Some Came Running, Rosalind Russell for Auntie Mame, and Elizabeth Taylor for Cat on a Hot Tin Roof, with the winner being, at last, Susan Hayward. So that's what to watch before our next episode. Thanks again, Cal.
Thank you.
And with that, I will bid you all adieu.